Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Form by Content discussion, which is presented by Khadija von Zinnenberg-Carroll and Veronica Teller and myself. I'm Helen Hughes. I'm a senior lecturer in art history, theory, and curatorial practice here at Monash University. I'm in my office at Monash on the Caulfield campus, which is on unceded Kulin Nation land. And of course, I pay my respect to Kulin Nation elders and ancestors, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are listening today. I've been asked to describe myself and where I'm sitting for the purposes of some of our listeners and viewers. So I've got my office door behind me, which you could call the color a sort of sallow, sickly green. I've got blonde hair. I'm still growing out some of my home haircut jobs from Melbourne's lockdown last year. I've got white skin and a blue shirt on today. The topic of our discussion today is embodied writing practices as a new method in art history. And each of us is coming at this theme or method in a slightly different way in our own research. But mainly we're having this conversation in response to Khadijah's new book, The Contested Crown: Repatriation Politics Between Europe and Mexico, which has just been published by the University of Chicago Press. And Veronica and I both had the pleasure of reading this book in the last few weeks, though somehow I managed to leave my copy of it at home this morning. So I'm not sure if either of you can hold it up to the screen. But given the theme of embodied writing, we thought that instead of me reeling off the CVs of Khadijah and Veronica, we'd just go around the room and introduce ourselves in the country we're speaking from today, because we're all in different parts of Australia. So Khadijah, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, greetings from Milau, the traditional land and waters of the Bunurong people, who I'd like to pay my deepest respects to. This is the part of the Pacific that is my ocean, and my mountains, as it were, are very far away in the Austrian Alps. And I talk about that a bit more in the book, the distance between these two loci that I'm from. I'm working as a professor of comparative history at the Central European University in Vienna, and of global art at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And yeah, I look forward to the conversation. Over to you, Veronica.
Thanks, Khadijah and Helen. So I'm on the lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and likewise would also like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and future. So I identify as a Chilean Australian art historian and work as a senior lecturer at UNSW Art and Design, which is also on the lands of the Bidjigal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Thank you.
Cool. Well, as I said, Veronica and I read Khadijah's book very closely, and being the studious people we are, took lots of notes, and we've got lots of questions for you, but we thought it would be better for everyone else listening in the audience if you could give Khadijah, a short introduction to your book for people who haven't read it yet.
Absolutely. And also say a bit about our topic of embodied writing. That's what
yes, very good point.
It links really nicely. And I'm so happy, Helen, thank you for hosting this and for the invitation, because it follows on really beautifully from the book that we did together, The Importance of Being Anachronistic, that Discipline published with the text. And this new book is really also about human relationships to objects in collections. And so I describe the bodies of material objects, although I don't call them objects, I actually treat them as subjects, and the ways in which they are, for example, inhabited by insects, birds, the movement of feathers in the wind, and yet also how that interlaces with forensics of conservation science, because I'm talking about a featherwork object called El Penacho, an Aztec feather crown, that has long been thought or said to be too fragile to travel back to Mexico from Vienna, where it is in the museum. And yet I kind of uncover that that's actually a ruse, that actually there are political interests in, of course, keeping something so so precious in the European Museum collection. I approach this through sympathetic resonance, and embodied writing for me is a turn to ethical handling of collections. The way this practice becomes public is in performance. So the Restitution of Complexity is a performance lecture in which I take the images from this 500-year history and bring them into space and into a embodied storytelling. So the way I write at present and in this book is by walking, actually. So I use my voice and dictate text and draw on conversations with others, conversations with myself. And that's the kind of polyphony that I'm thinking through. So the idea of many voices that are not in any kind of hierarchy. This is a pretty instinctive approach in a way. I was interested in how to bring rhythm to my texts and also how to approach my writing as something site-specific, which I do in my installation and film practice. But I realized that when I write in this way through walking and recording and then transcribing, that when I go back and transcribe, that I'm actually also returning to that country, and that triggers memories and that fleshes out that text even further. So as I said in my introduction, I'm working at two ends of the Pacific Ocean at present. On one hand in Mexico, on the other where I am here in Millau, Phillip Island, and yet also returning, and we'll talk about this later, to these collections in Europe. I'll be in the book talking a little bit about other artists' interventions as well. So Eduardo Abaroa's total destruction of the museum in Mexico City, Nina Höchtel's transcultural legacy, Claudia Pena Salinas Quetzali. These are all contemporary artists in Mexico City who are also approaching this very contested site. And this is all by way of introduction of the relationship of embodied writing to the affective turn, the implication of that for the eye of the writer that Veronica has written about really compellingly. And this is a way also to pass over to her to introduce a little bit more about her work on embodiment.
Thanks, Khadija, for throwing it towards me, and thanks for that recounting of your book. So I actually, so before this conversation, Helen, Khadija, and I decided that we'd each, I guess, try and define embodied writing as a way of connecting our thinking and pushing that thinking together today. So I'll just, I guess, define that through the notes that I made. So I guess I would define embodied writing as being about positioning the I, laying it bare, but also being relational and having an intimate, being intimate with the subject matter rather than having critical distance. It's definitely, to my mind, about undoing the fiction of universal readings and objectivity. It's also ultimately about disconnecting from the tools we have inherited as art historians. So the tools of Kant, Hegel, Winckelmann, or what a dear friend of Helen and I and founding editor of Discipline, Nick Croggan, calls the straight white guy of art history. The acronym for that is SWGAH, pronounced swagger. And I'm trying to mobilize this term as a key term of contemporary art history writing. So yeah, embodied writing is about taking inventory of what we have inherited, including that which we willingly acquired, or that which we have, or that which has been imposed upon us. So to quote the Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldúa, we can put history through a sieve, winnow out the lies, look at the forces that we as a race, as women, have been part of, and from that take inventory of what we wish to carry forward. So it's about inheritance and tradition, including that which we want to reject. And it's finally about being present with and accountable to the histories we are writing. I think the I and art history are one and the same. They have to be enmeshed. And yeah, so I think Khadija does that really beautifully in the book. It's yeah, I don't know if you want to have contribute, Helen, and define embodied writing as well before we head to Khadija and ask her more about her method.
Yeah, okay. I made some notes myself, actually. So I was thinking, you know, in terms of embodied writing, probably the aspect of my research that's most relevant to this topic is, and most relevant to the methods that Khadija uses in her book, concerns, you know, settler colonial history in the Australian context. And yes, I guess what I've been very slowly but surely working on over the last few years is a history of convict art in Australia, focusing on the period of transportation between 1787 and 1868. And this always comes up in the class that I teach on art writing at Monash. But, you know, if I'm being honest with myself, my art historical writing is very unexperimental, and it would probably be fair to describe it as disembodied. But it's something that I'm trying to bash out of my system. And, you know, as we were talking about before we started the recording today, working as an art historian in an art school was a really awesome way of exploding all those conventions that, you know, at least Veronica and I were taught in art history at University of Melbourne. So I suppose the key thing I took from Khadija's book on this topic was the idea of understanding how family history can intersect with more public and collective histories. And interestingly, the first book on convict women, written by Babette Smith, it's called A Cargo of Women, has been described, you know, even a little contemptuously as a sophisticated family history, because essentially in it, she's tracing the story of one of her ancestors, a convict woman named Susanna Watson. And I myself became interested in convict history through my dad, who every year gives everyone in our family a revised family history of the Hugheses, Lilleens, Moons and O'Tooles, which he always has spiral bound at Officeworks. And my dad also has this really funny Anglo-Saxon middle name, which is Langford, which always sounded strange to my ears. And it turns out that the name comes from one of our convict ancestors, who was a highway robber from Lancashire. And my dad always found the association with this middle name either embarrassing or funny. And to go back to what Veronica was saying about affect and embodied writing, these are the kinds of affects that I'm interested in exploring in the way that convict, you know, what convict ancestry, what kinds of affects it stirs up in white Australians, because the figure of the convict has obviously always been used as a means of forging and forgetting aspects of settler Australian identity and history, whether the convict is repressed as an embarrassment to the family, or as became increasingly more common from the 1970s onwards, becomes a misplaced source of ethno-nationalist pride. Anyway, I think I'll leave it at that, just with the affects associated with convict ancestry and white Australian identity, and what sort of, you know, these are important to me because convicts not only were crucial to the invasion and colonization of this continent, but they're also crucial to the foundation of non-Indigenous Australian or settler Australian art history. But maybe this is a good moment because Khadija, in the book, family history is important. And also, you know, I was thinking with my dad's middle name, a name is very important for you kind of unraveling your family history and how it relates to the topic of your book. So would you like to say a little bit more about how family history operates in your research?
Yeah, sure. So I was really interested in the ethical implications of positioning my own family history rather than only telling other people's family histories, which inevitably is what you do when you're a historian, whether it's in the settler colony or of other artists' biographies. And something I was often told here by Indigenous scholars was how important it was to not only know your own genealogy or whakapapa, as the Maori call it, but to to really, I guess, inhabit that rather than this sort of quasi illusion of an objective, which I instinctively felt this thing about academic writing, that you are sort of assuming a distance to your material, is actually quite unnatural and false. And once you begin to dismantle that illusion, you inevitably come back to yourself. And that's also very uncomfortable, but it felt like maybe an uncomfortable process that perpetrators with histories that are not, yeah, I mean, the convict history is not clear, right? It's a kind of, and it's also shifted over time. But what I found in my own family history, which, as you say, one has to get through the kind of the lay historians in the family who have come up with the versions that they find palatable. And at least the kind of rigorous application of archival research then brought me to a much more unexpected and also deeply colonial, but not the colony that I had grown up in Australia, but rather this colonial relationship between Central Europe, so Augsburg, Germany, the Habsburg Empire, and Latin America, which through Karl V basically was colonized and was traded with. So slaves were sent in one direction, and sugar, spices, all these things were the cargo that were on the boats when they weren't carrying slaves. And looking at those kind of contracts that were made and the objects that were traded at the same time and collected into, so the book is a object biography of one of these things that was on one of these boats, and it's not clear which one actually, and that's also its part of its contestation is because that provenance isn't clear. And I guess with this is a much older colonial history than we know from Australia, but at the same time, I've always been intrigued by those histories of slavery that have used just a small line of an inventory or an insurance wager from a slaver or so, and out of that, like Stephanie Smallwood or Christina Sharp, then in the Wake, for example, as a book, have then been able to really richly flesh out through fictocriticism a story of what might have happened to those people. So that's what I'm doing, not actually to the people in my family, because I didn't want to kind of indulge in too much of that. And it did always feel like it was quite risky to actually write about any kind of family history, because it is such a lowly kind of category of writing. But at the same time, yeah, I wanted to also turn that around and think about if I was going to write a book about the ethics of ownership and property, then I think looking at one's own history of those property relations is a good place to start.
Thank you.
Thanks, Khadija. Can I jump in with a question? So it's like being a student. So I guess yeah, like one of the things that Helen and I also really enjoyed about your book, and as to, you know, I guess art historians who, you know, trained in an art history department and now work at an art school, was the way in which you made manifest your encounters with these different histories and subjects through practice-led research. And I think that for me, like a key, I don't know if you would call it a framework, but let's use that term now for now. Like a key framework for advancing embodied writing is practice-led research, in part because, as you know, we're all aware, in an art school, it's all, you know, artists, unlike art historians, are always performing themselves. Like art historians tend to hide behind books or objects and make themselves as invisible as possible on the page. And what you begin every chapter, as Helen has noticed, with an epigraph of it's kind of like an atlas. We'll show an image of this, but it's an atlas of the different images and reproductions that I guess that that represent the different ways in which you've encountered, but also interpret and reread these subjects and cultural histories. So yeah, if you could kind of speak to how you write and think through practice-led research, you kind of embody a subjectivity that is neither or artist or art historian or cultural historian. It's all of them, and I think that this is also key to embodied writing, because you need to find different resources and tools to do that than any one discipline can offer.
Yeah, thank you. Artistic research is definitely the framework in which I thought of this book, and those epigraphs. I mean, I can talk about one that you will see on screen. And this is got Sigmund Freud with this collage of actually the very degraded backside of the feather crown, and it's been eaten by insects, but all once it got to Europe, so all of its kind of all the damage has happened post that passage from America to Europe. And there's some text over this very cut up kind of Freud wearing the crown, and that is Stockholm syndrome. And the Stockholm syndrome I identify in the book is one where the victim identifies with and actually kind of adores the perpetrator, right? That's the kind of standard reading of Stockholm syndrome. And the strange situation is that in Austria, this object, which they've kept now for over 400 years, is actually been instrumentalized politically, especially in the 20th century. And these are chapters that are about the history of Holocaust looting of artworks during the Holocaust, and the ways that that historical framework has been used now in colonial cases. So, but I'm working on a more psychological level, and Ruben Gallo actually wrote a beautiful book called Freud's Mexico about psychoanalysis, about a lot of the Jewish immigrants who escaped the Second World War in Mexico and were given exile by the left-wing Mexican government of the time. And I go through that history in more detail as well. But the irony is that those Jewish exiles in Mexico then are the first to think that it would be a wonderful gift of thanks to actually have Austria in the post-war kind of mess that it's in, as is this huge perpetrator state, to actually give as a gift of thanks, and a gift of thanks not only for saving these people, but also because it was the only country, along with the Soviet Union, to actually protest at the League of Nations the annexation of Austria in 1938. So the Nazis just very easily take Austria because there are so many fascists within Austria. And Mexico actually says this is the death of this nation, and brings it to the UN at the time. And that is used later. Later, of course, Vienna and Austria will claim that they were victims, that actually, they were annexed by Germany, this much larger state, and that they had no agency. And that proof of that was that Mexico stood up for them and tried to rescue them. And later they would then also, this is in the sort of 80s and 90s, this discussion gets going because there are all sorts of trials. Waldheim, for example, is one who's a senator who's then, all the Nazi kind of histories are starting to be revealed. And it becomes clear that the Austrians are going to use this object to try and remind people that actually they were good, and Mexico could identify this. So this kind of strange relationship also on the Mexican side of, on one hand, hating Austria for being the colonizer in the 19th century, because the Habsburgs had this 3-year emperor of Mexico who was an Austrian in the mid-19th century, but also at the same time, through the legacy that he left of building this, beginning the first major museum in Mexico City, etc., also having a deep identification and kind of affection for Austria. So that's the kind of weird entanglement. I realize that that's very complex and might be like, whoa, what's going on there? But that's the kind of mesh, and why I use this diagrammatic layout for each chapter was to begin to put some of the key terms out. You know, you've got terms in all sorts of different languages. You've got Nahuatl. Quetzalcoatl is the Nahuatl name for this piece, and Nahuatl is a language that is beginning to be learned and used more. There's obviously Spanish, German also, because it's talking about German memorial culture, and and some other English terms that you'll see. Yeah.
Thank you. So another of the really strong values that comes through reading your book, which I think is really relevant to talk about in terms of embodied writing practices, is that of being an active or even activist art historian, which is a figure you juxtapose with the armchair historian, who ends up, this one particular armchair historian, is it Anders? I'm trying to remember the name, becomes this kind of key character, or straw man even in the book, appropriately. But I suppose one thing I'd be really interested in hearing you speak a little bit more about is a decision that you made quite early on in your career to sort of effectively succeed from Australia or leave and go to Europe, where you can get stuck into European colonial archives and make change happen from there.
Yeah. So Ferdinand Anders, just as a figure, is very important because you have this authoritative historian who is always advising the government there about the kind of proper history and what can be said and what can't be said. And it keeps being cited. So in a sense, it's very interesting to have a character like that who has a huge library. This is what we mean by armchair, just to sort of flesh that out. But doesn't feel the need to ever travel to Latin America because he has more books, he says, than any library he would have access to there, and he can write his kind of authoritative history from the comforts of his home in the countryside in Austria. I decided rather reverse that strategy, because of course you can do that. That armchair exists anywhere in the world. It's more the way in which you decide to either sit in it or, as I thought, to return. I mean, on one hand, get myself off the unceded territory, because that didn't seem a viable place from which to launch the kind of critique or to think through my own implication or positionality anymore. And I moved to the States and to various parts of Europe, and thought that actually the Colonial Archive had so much in it that, I mean, that wasn't colonial, that was actually looted, and perhaps even just a mediating role of giving access to that material and making that material public was something that I could do as a first step. And there was a fantastic intervention of this kind actually in the museum that I've been working in Vienna just the past months, and that is two activist filmmakers got a bunch of young people to replace the audio guides in the museum with the narrative, with a different narrative about this Penacho, about this Quetzalcoatl piece we're talking about. And they used the voice of the protesters that I cite at length in this kind of polyphonic approach that's a bit like attempting a Benjaminian Passagenwerk, where I just let the protesters speak because they're never cited in the press and they're always ridiculed. And someone like Ferdinand Anders just thinks that they're, you know, bad kind of speaking kind of tourist Latin, and just is always poo-pooing them. But actually what they have to say, of course, is that kind of first-hand approach of the traditional owners. And so all of a sudden, for the past few months, if someone went to the museum, they actually heard their voices, but the museum itself hadn't realized. And then the activists revealed this to the press, and it was all very uncomfortable in the museum because it's diligently trying to decolonize itself, ideally with artists that haven't been invited, was quite happy and said, oh, this is just the kind of approach that we've been hoping for. So that's been a good example, for example.
Thanks.
Outsourcing, decolonizing. So building on what you were just saying, Khadija, I know that you're, as you've spoken today, and for those that read the book or have read the book, will note the polyphony of voices that are embedded in the text. And so I thought, I mean, I'm personally, as someone who's writing in this form, but very recently, in the last year really, interested in what your pitch was to the University of Chicago Press, and their reception, because obviously the topic is compelling, but the armchair historian is still very easily publishable, even though it might be read by a very limited audience. It's still seen as the easier route to take. I know that in the peer reviews for the couple of essays that I've developed, either in a like in a performative form of embodied writing or as written as letters, has been received, I mean, negatively and positively, but definitely always wanting like an abstract or an introduction that shoves the essay back into a conventional form. So yeah, University of Chicago Press is like emerging, to my mind, I don't know what you think, Helen, but it's like a really interesting art historical publisher at the moment. So yeah, keen to hear what your experience has been.
Yeah, so they really helped me a lot. They were amazing in terms of tone, because I wanted to write something that was for everyone to read and not heavily theoretical the way like Art and Time of Colony, my previous monograph, is. I wanted some, and it was a fine line that we trod. They said as soon as Derrida is mentioned, this is not a trade book. This will put a lot of readers off. But that wasn't a trade that I would make. Derrida's still in there. But the script for my performance was the basis for the book, and that definitely got heavily reworked, and I inserted it again at the end, but it wasn't like they were willing to have some experimental piece of writing. It had to be something that would be kind to the reader, that was actually easy to digest for someone who's not an expert in any of the material. And I really appreciate the way they help through editing, or rather through constantly sending it back to me and saying rework it over really a long time, that the text became what it is now. But that's been my experience, as you've said, of submitting things that are experimental writing, descriptions of performances, or things that are not an academic essay, and publishers usually, allowing it, but only allowing it if it's sort of at the beginning and framed, and then you do something else as well. Even in my education in the States, it was the same. It was sort of, there was an appreciation of the weirdness of something outside of traditional academic writing, but at the same time, you always had to demonstrate that you understood and can also do that. So I don't think we're there yet, that we have a publishing world or an audience that is willing to, and I think it partly is the market, right? That something like Chicago is a very market kind of aware press, and this is what readers want. They want something easy. And unfortunately, experimental and easy don't go together.
Yeah,
we live in our enclaves of the art school and are much more interested in reading something that's non-linear and fun. But I think realistically, that's a very small percentage, and that's why there are these art books, and they have their own kind of world. And then something like this book is, I guess the real challenge for me was how to balance both those things, how to keep the artistic research and practice in there. I would have loved full color and full page spreads and a book that looks like an art book, but also that So there was a constant negotiation with the press, in which I had very little say in the decisions. And I just had to sort of be grateful and think that they know best. So
yeah, it is interesting though that it's you know, for the last, I don't know, like more than a decade, it's publishers like eFlux or Sternberg which do prioritize the artist's voice and practice-led research. Like maybe the most influential essayist of our generation has been Hito Steyl, for example. So I think there is like a real, maybe very unhealthy disconnect between what people are reading and what academic presses in art history are publishing generally. Because it's also, I'm also just thinking of like in queer theory, feminist theory, like figures like Julietta Singh or Jack Halberstam or Gloria Anzaldúa for generations have been doing embodied writing. It's not an issue in those areas, just in crusty old art history.
I mean, Helen runs and publishes so many wonderful things through Discipline, and it's so admirable to actually begin a press so that you can shape the space of Australian art history. So yeah, please say something about how you approach it as an editor, because I know how we approach it as editors of Third Text, which is more of a journal, and we try to include people who don't have English as a first language, for example. We're very dedicated to that. But then you give it out to peer review, as you have to, and all of a sudden you're at the mercy of these academics who are experts, but just hate experimental writing. It's a swagger problem.
It is a swagger problem. The question was something about Discipline. Well, the very easy way to respond to that is to say that Discipline has never been peer reviewed or indeed accepted by the university as a research output, which is difficult because it's a bit hard to claim research income that we, are awarded as research income, or indeed the books that we publish as an output. But most recently we published, not everything that we publish has the quality of embodied writing as much as I admire it, but our most recent book is called Homework, written by one of Veronica's colleagues, Astrid Larange at UNSW, and her partner Andrew Brooks. And it for us was perhaps the most embodied form of writing, where the two of them write as a couple to each other, to their child, and in a very located place, drawing heavily, as Veronica just said, on the disciplines of queer theory and feminist history and theory, where, as you said, it's never been an issue. It's just a natural mode of writing. Yes. Yeah,
I would say that your both Discipline has also published those really excellent books on Elizabeth Newman, and the others escape my memory right now, but it is generating like a parallel art historical discourse, whether or not it's authorized.
Oh, thank you. Unauthorized art history.
The best.
The very best. Well, we might have time for one more question, and I feel like one thing that we haven't covered yet is the very central topic and preoccupation of the book, which is the question of digital repatriation, Khadija, which you've worked on in other books, including the book you did with Julie Gough. It was extraordinary to me to read in the book all the different propositions that the museum in Vienna is coming up with to avoid giving back this object to the original owners in Mexico, the most spectacular of which is proposing that they create a hologram that they would give back to Mexico. But that besides, you do chart a very interesting critique of this new, or maybe it's not new, but idea of digital repatriation. I wondered if you want to, perhaps as like the last, closing kind of comments, say a bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I've been thinking through this idea of new originals and the ways in which what we're doing as contemporary artists, intervening in museums, which is what we were doing in the Julie Gough project already, and in a lot of the work that I've been part of, whether as a mediator, curator, artist, filmmaker, in various roles. But in this new role, it's really about facilitating a comparative, and this was also to come to that definition you wanted of what is global art history, and that is more of a comparative transnational history written very much from the stakeholder community perspectives and from researchers within those artistic researchers, and to see what then can be built as a discussion between those sites and the then emptied museums in Europe as they do begin to return physical objects, but also so digital repatriation in a sense, definitely not instead of returning the material and often very sacred and unique original, but as a way of perhaps then thinking through that empty space that's left in those museums, thinking through the way in which relationships are built and that are often very much desired with those large institutions like the Musée des Cordons Branly, the British Museum, the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and actually binding those institutions into a relationship of responsibility in which they then also support the new museums that are being built around Africa, for example. So that's the ways in which the digital has entered this current work that I'm doing. But I know Veronica actually had some thoughts. Maybe there's also a space for you to say something at the end if you like.
Oh, on that topic, well, I think, I would just say that I agree with what you're saying. And yeah, like in the context that I work in across Australia and Chile, and Chilean art history, that discourse around digital repatriation manifested in similar ways in which it's manifested regarding the contested crown or El Penacho, like arguments being made around Chile not having the proper infrastructure to maintain and hold artworks that were developed, for example, during the Pinochet dictatorship, which may or may not be true. And I think digital repatriation is not the preferable outcome. It's just reiterating economic inequality and geopolitical norms that definitely need to be undone. So not sure if Destroy, I can't remember the artist's name, but Destroy in the Museum is the preferred outcome in that particular context, but I do love that work.
Yeah, I think we should stop probably.
I totally agree, and I think we'll have to continue the conversation offline, but yes, on behalf of Monash, thank you so much, Khadija and Veronica. It was really great to chat with you both. And I was going to note, Khadija, is the book available online for free as a PDF?
Yes.
This is true.
Yes.
Okay, so everybody can access it online.
On the publisher's website, there's a link to an open access version.
Yeah, I definitely encourage everyone to read it.
Yes.
Yes. So thanks again. See you all soon.